there is a distinction between change and transition. We can think of change as something replacing something else. Change is usually significant and stark. It can be very sudden and has a distinct end of one thing and beginning of something else. Change is often marked by before and after. Transition is more subtle shifts. These little tiny incremental, little bit smoother, sometimes unnoticeable shifts and transitions that ultimately make up the big change. The whole notion of transition or shift is that it's the process, the unfolding, the evolution. So think of transition or shifts as the tiny micro moments that eventually make up the big change that you notice. Welcome to the GenX Shift podcast, a show for Gen Xers who are navigating some pretty tough transitions and aren't sure how to move forward. I'm your host, Michele Walter, proud Gen Xer, former lawyer turned entrepreneur, huge Jason Momoa fan, and margarita snob. And I've navigated a lot of transitions in my life, from losing my mom suddenly to a heart attack to starting my own business. But I often did it all on my own because I was too stubborn to ask for help. Now I'm on a mission to give actionable strategies to other Gen Xers so that they can find the confidence, courage, and clarity they need to make a shift. So let's rock and roll. Hey Gen Xers, welcome back from wherever you are joining in the world. I have found it really cool to get to look at all the different podcast statistics, and I get to see where people join from. And it's so cool to get to see different countries, different parts of the United States, of North America. So wherever you are joining from, thank you. I'm really glad that you're here. And if you want, wherever you're listening, drop me a comment to let me know where you're joining from. This week, we have a solo episode because I've had some thoughts percolating about transitions that I want to share. And this is going to be a two-parter solo episode series. Today, we are going to cover 3 observations that I think are really critical for understanding change versus transition. And then next week, I'm going to actually give you some practical tips, practices, and teachings that you can use to support yourself through these transitions that we're facing. But before we get into that today, I want to give a special shout out to Michael O'Brien from episode 14 because I'm going to pan the camera down for those of you watching on video on YouTube. He sent me this amazing Pause, Breathe, Reflect shirt, which has this in the center. It's a circle design. In the center, it says Pause, Breathe, Reflect in this cool, funky kind of 70s font. And then around it are circles that say ripple love in all kinds of different colors. And the shirt itself that he sent me is kind of an orangish color, which I love. It's great for me. Really soft material, really comfortable. And he did a couple of really cool things. Inside the t-shirt in the back, he wrote his story. He wrote about his last bad day, which he talked about in episode 14. And on the very back, on the outside, it says slow is fast. I love this t-shirt. I'm so grateful to Michael that he sent it to me. And if you want to get your own, go back to the show notes for episode 14 and click the link, because he has a discount of 50% off for all the Gen X Shift podcast listeners. So thanks, Michael. All right, let's dive into today's topic because I think it's a really important one, because if you're aware that you're going through transition, and let's be real, a lot of Gen Xers are just blissfully unaware, and that's fine. Y'all probably aren't listening to this podcast anyway. If you are aware, though, that there has been some changes in your life, that you're going through something, then this is going to be the episode for you, because there are 3 critical things that I have observed about change versus transition. And to help you along with this, because we're going to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time, I'm going to keep this a shorter episode. You can access a free download. So you can pause the video audio right now, go print that off if you want to follow along, or you can grab it after you're done listening to this. But this handout covers everything that I'm going to talk about today. So don't feel like you have to sit here like you're in class and take a bunch of notes. Just sit back, relax, take it in, trust that what lands will land where it's supposed to land. All right, so let's start with the first observation that I have had in working through transition for myself and with my clients, and over having these discussions over the last couple of months with my guests. And it's this: there is a distinction between change and transition. So let's get clear on what those terms really mean. Change is a broad reference to some type of alteration or modification. We can think of change as something replacing something else. Change is usually significant and stark. It can be very sudden. It can be slower, but usually it's pretty sudden and has a distinct end of one thing and beginning of something else. That's the replacement of one thing with the substitution of something else. Change is really a moment in time. It's an event, often external events, although it can be something that happens to us so we can experience a physical change, right? And even with that, there's going to be a marked ending of one thing and beginning of the next thing. So let's give you a couple of examples. You change your shoes, right? You come home from the end of the day, you take your shoes off, you're wearing socks, or you go from high heels to tennis shoes. You change your shoes. You replace one thing with something else. There's an ending, there's a beginning. Pretty simple. You also change careers. You substitute one job or career for another. The death of someone is a change. There is a very clear ending and a very clear beginning. Change is often marked by before and after. So for me, my life is marked by the change of my mom dying. There was life before my mom, life after my mom died. Okay? So let's compare that to transition. Transition is more subtle shifts. These little tiny incremental, little bit smoother, sometimes unnoticeable shifts and transitions that ultimately make up the big change. These shifts and transitions, they're harder to notice because they are small and they are more subtle. There's really, from our perspective, no discernible or distinct end and beginning. The whole notion of transition or shift is that it's the process, the unfolding, the evolution. It's the whole before, during, and after. Okay? So think of transition or shifts as the tiny micro moments that eventually make up the big change that you notice. Let me give you a couple examples. You shift your perspective, right? You start to gradually have these little transitions in how you're thinking or feeling that may ultimately lead to something that feels like you have changed your perspective, where you now have one perspective that you didn't have before. Okay. Another example, you might transition to a plant-based lifestyle. That involves a lot of little incremental changes. Now, you could do it overnight, just clean out your fridge and eat nothing but plants starting tomorrow. That would be a pretty big change. And you can also do it more subtly with smaller steps so that you, over time, make that shift, make that transition, and evolve into a plant-based lifestyle. So, you getting the distinction there between change and transition? The reason I want to make that distinction is that, as you'll see in the next observation I have, it can be important for how we face or don't face what we're going through in life and all of the changes that are being foisted on us or the changes that we want to make, and how we can learn to move through, evolve, gradually shift and transition through those changes. So I'm being kind of particular about language, which, as my clients know, I like to do, because I think we want to be intentional with the language that we're using. Which leads me to my second observation. And it's that we often react to and notice the changes, not the transitions. Change is what catches our attention. These subtle little shifts and transitions usually don't, because as I said, they're smaller, they're more subtle, they're a little more unnoticeable. Big change, though, catches our attention. When we are evolving, going through something, it's often hard for us to know until we get to the point where we look back and we're like, oh, I used to weigh this much, or I used to be this active, and now I'm not. Now I weigh this much. Maybe we didn't notice all the subtle little ways that our health was changing, right? The important thing to remember here is that even though change is what usually catches our attention because it's stark, there's an end and a beginning, we are actually transitioning, shifting, and thus changing all the time. We just don't notice it. We don't notice the subtleties, the little micro moments. Those are the things that we miss until change comes and grabs our attention. There are two ways really that change happens to grab our attention: voluntary and involuntary. Of course, voluntary change are the changes that we want to make. Maybe we want to lose 20 pounds. And so we have an intention, we have a plan for making that change happen. Maybe we want to change careers. So we make that change happen. Voluntary, pretty easy, right? Involuntary ones are the ones that kind of sneak up on us. They can usually be unexpected and pretty sudden, like getting fired or laid off. That's an involuntary change that we weren't necessarily planning for or that we wanted to make on our own. Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, that change or the anticipated change is what catches our attention. And the reason is because, again, there's a gap to cover between the end of the one thing and the beginning of the other thing. There's a before and after. And that is what grabs our attention. The third observation are 3 obstacles that make change difficult. So a change has grabbed your attention. It's either something that's happened to you involuntarily, or it's a change that you realize you want to make. Either way, there can be 3 things that crop up to make that change more challenging and maybe even shut you down to the point where you can't cope with it or you don't want to make the voluntary change. So the first one here is probably the biggest one, is uncertainty. Humans hate uncertainty. Does anybody here love uncertainty? No. And there's a reason for it. I won't get into the neuroscience into the weeds. If you really want to geek out on some neuroscience, I recommend Andrew Huberman or Rick Hansen. I'll put links to their work in the show notes. But from a very simplified biological level, our brains are wired to want and crave certainty, because certainty equals knowing, equals being able to handle and control circumstances, things that impact our survival. So uncertainty equals unknown equals potential threats to our survival. It's really kind of that basic. When our survival feels threatened, when something is uncertain, that means that we are in an activated, dysregulated state. Our amygdalas in our brain are functioning in hyperdrive, which means that our executive function, our prefrontal cortex, is shutting down. That means when we're in survival mode, we're not able to problem solve as well. We can't see all of the options in front of us because our vision literally is very myopic because we are just focused on survival. We are purely focused on fight, flight, or freeze. And in that survival mode, we can't sort of problem solve and brainstorm and see all the options and pause and take our time, right? So when we are anticipating a change, or when an unexpected involuntary change has happened to us, that usually comes with a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty can look like, for example, when my mom died, one of the very first things I said was, I don't know how to do my life without my mom. Very uncertain period of time for me because I had functioned for 40 years with my mom in my corner as my biggest cheerleader. I didn't know how to do life without her. That was a complete unknown to me. Therefore, I felt threatened to my core in how do I live without my mom? And that uncertainty can come about even when it's a change that we want to make. I'll take the example of me wanting to quit being an attorney and start my own business. For a long time, I was paralyzed, that freeze mode of survival, in I don't know what else to do with my life other than be an attorney. That uncertainty of not knowing what else I could do with my life. I had trained for decades to be an attorney. What else could I possibly do? How would I pay the bills? How would I make that work? Blah, 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 right? How? All of that is uncertainty. That triggered my survival response. I was in freeze mode for a while. And then I did eventually get into fight mode, which can be one of the good responses of that in terms of like planning. I'm going to figure my way out of this, right? Like, so whether the change is voluntary or involuntary, there most likely is going to be uncertainty associated with that. We hate it. It makes us uncomfortable. It dysregulates us and it puts us into survival mode, and therefore makes it very hard for us to figure out, executive function our way through the change and even know what to do. The second obstacle that comes up when change is presented to us is cognitive dissonance. You may or may not have heard this phrase, so let me define it for you. It's mental discomfort that results from holding conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. Humans like consistency, again, probably because we like certainty. So if we have a particular value or belief that we hold, and something happens, or we start to notice that we might have another value or another belief that we want to have, that creates cognitive dissonance for us. And we don't like that. Cognitive dissonance can be a really good motivator for behavior change. And it can also be kind of paralyzing because in the face of those conflicting beliefs or values or attitudes, it can often look like there's too much of a gap to make up here. There's too much distance to cover for me to either reconcile those or to give up the one attitude or belief and adopt another one. So if we are looking at a voluntary change we want to make, for example, coming back to my attorney situation, there was a little bit of cognitive dissonance going on there for me because I knew I didn't feel aligned with my values and my purpose in life as an attorney. And I had also invested a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of student loan debt in being an attorney. So there was some cognitive dissonance going on there. I didn't know how to reconcile those. If that's coming up for you, please know that that's normal. I mean, this is part of growth as we move through change, which is why we want to focus on the shifts and transitions and making tiny steps, which I'll talk about next week. The third obstacle that can come up is identity change or identity dissonance. So identity change is really linked more to behavioral changes. Things that are linked to your self-efficacy, your purpose, your belonging, like stepping into a new identity so that you feel purposeful, which again was my example. I did not feel purposeful in my identity as an attorney. And so I needed to make the change into becoming a coach and a mindfulness teacher and an entrepreneur, because that identity was more aligned with my purpose. So that change of quitting my job and realizing that I needed to do something that was more purposeful, it had an identity change that was required too. And again, that identity change can be scary and uncomfortable and dysregulating for us. Related to that is the concept of identity dissonance, which my understanding, that's a phrase that was coined by a woman named Sarah Benjamin. I'll link a website for her in the show notes as well. And similar to cognitive dissonance, identity dissonance is when we have conflicting identities, kind of like what I described before. Don't worry about whether you want to call it, whether it's called identity change or identity dissonance. Just know this, the big takeaway from this third obstacle is that when you are confronted with change, either voluntary or involuntary, it may require or be challenging you with a different identity. And that different identity can, come back to obstacle number one, be uncertain and therefore be dysregulating and uncomfortable for us. So again, the three obstacles, there are probably more. I'm just focusing on those three for now because these are the big ones that I've seen coming up for myself and for my clients. The three obstacles, again, are uncertainty, cognitive dissonance, and identity change or identity dissonance. Those three obstacles can make the big change hard to deal with, hard to navigate. And when I say big change, I mean, that could be something like changing a job to dealing with the death of somebody, right? There's a whole spectrum of change. I say big because, again, it's the change that catches our attention. It's big because it's the culmination of all of these other little shifts and transitions. So the invitation here, now that we know that there's a distinction between change and transition, that it's the change that usually catches our attention, not the shifts and transition, and that there are three obstacles to change, what we want to learn to do, obviously, is to focus on and make the smaller, more subtle shifts and transitions. Those are what will feel better. They won't be such a stark, disorienting experience. This is the reason for cheesy sayings like one step at a time, 1 degree difference. That 1 degree difference is a really fantastic analogy because in the hiking world, if you have an old school compass and you are 1 degree off in reading or calibrating that compass over a pretty good distance, that can result in you being miles off of your target. So 1 degree is really important. Don't underestimate the power of 1 degree, of one tiny step, because it's more comforting for your nervous system. You're not making this huge change. You're doing something small and subtle that is evolving you, transitioning you toward the change, and it's more palatable. It has less uncertainty when you're just talking about one small step or 1 degree. It doesn't create that big gap that creates cognitive dissonance or identity dissonance because you're just talking about one little thing. I can do one little thing. That doesn't turn me into a completely different person or make me jump off a cliff or quit my job tomorrow. It's just one little thing. So that's what we're going to focus on next week, are some really practical strategies and teachings and lessons and tools and all the good things that can help you be able to focus more in your life on how you make the smaller shifts so that you can transition through the bigger changes, honestly, with more ease. And so that you can move forward at all. Because remember, sometimes that change seems so overwhelming. Just there's such a huge amount of ground to cover. How will I ever do that? By one small shift at a time. There's a reason I named the podcast the GenX Shift. It's not the GenX change. It's the GenX Shift. because I want to invite you and teach you how to do these small incremental shifts that over time you will be able to look back and you will see the change. But it won't be change that's so overwhelming or so uncertain. Now, if you download the free resource this week, which I highly encourage you to do, it's going to be in the show notes, which, by the way, it's at lifefromthesummit.com/podcast/17 for this episode. There are 6 reflections that I invite you to chew on over the next week or so. And the first reflection is, what are the 3 to 5 most important changes that have happened or that you anticipate happening in your life? The second reflection, what has been your reaction to those changes or anticipated changes? Third, what feels or felt uncertain about those changes? Fourth, where do you notice some cognitive dissonance coming up around those changes? Fifth, where do you notice an identity change or identity dissonance coming up around those changes? And sixth, what shifts or transitions would you like to notice more in your life? So reflect on those over the next week. Let them kind of settle in, let some seeds get planted for you. And next week, we'll come back with some things that will support you in making those smaller shifts so that over time, you can either have a better relationship with changes that have happened to you, or you can learn how to make more of the changes that you want to make for you. Now, if this is sort of piquing your curiosity and sort of giving you goosebumps, you feel some tingly feelings, like stuff is coming up, like, oh, this is kind of fun, I'm kind of curious about this. I have a GenX Shift program that is designed to support you in making these kinds of incremental changes and shifts in a very intentional way. You can learn more about that on my website at lifefromthesummit.com/GenX Shift program. You can check it out, schedule a call with me if that sounds interesting for you. And I'm also going to link in the show notes an article that I wrote a while back called 7 Quotes to Guide Gen Xers Through Transitions in Our 40s and Beyond. I think there's some fun, inspiring quotes in there that you might find supportive. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I hope you enjoyed this shorty little episode. Leave me a comment wherever you're listening. And as always, I really appreciate you liking, sharing, and rating the podcast. It's a tremendous help, especially if you can share it with somebody else who you think might want to know about these 3 observations about transition versus change. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I can't wait to give you the next episode next week. So until then, Gen Xers, stay gold.